So let me introduce to you now the Associate Director of our National Security Program, someone I think for almost everybody in this room needs no introduction, since she, as much as anyone else, was responsible for helping to put this together. Senior Fellow in the Tower Center, my great friend and colleague, Ms. Lynn Novak, who will welcome and introduce General Cartwright and the panel. So please, a round of applause for Lynn Novak. Lynn, you want to...
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to make sure that you just know we're on a very tight time schedule, so please do keep moving as we need you to move. I'd like to make a few introductions before we start. First, Dennis Ippolito, and please hold your applause until the end. Where's Dennis? Is he in here? Right over here. Dennis is chair of the Political Science Department and is a renowned scholar in the national budgeting process. And he has presented the theme of this conference to our sponsors and been responsible for setting the whole tone of the conference. Jim, you've just met, and he's been instrumental in this conference as well, keeping a tight hand on the reins. Pat Walsh, Admiral Walsh, who is up here already. We heard from him last night, and he is our newest senior fellow in the Tower Center and the acting director of our National Security Program. We have a few of our board members, I think, Penny and Jean Cox over here, Penny Cook and Jean Cox, who are daughters of John Tower and founders and supporters, loyal supporters of the Tower Center. Anybody else from our board that's here that I haven't seen yet? Okay. I'd like to acknowledge our collaborating partners. We have several people from the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations here. We have several members of the World Affairs Council who will be here or are here already. And then I wanted to do a special thanks to Ben's business executives for national security, and especially our Texas Regional Director, Matthew Elias. Matthew and his boss, who is also a member of our advisory committee for the National Security Program, General Monty Meggs, who's the president of the National Benz Organization. They both have been instrumental in setting up our industry panel, and I want to thank them for that. Okay, and finally, our great Raytheon team. So we have been working together for 5 years now, and we're very happy that they have continued with us. And we have really been good partners through this whole thing, and they've been very helpful. So Dan Crowley will be he will be chairing our industry panel, the president of Raytheon Centric Systems. I got it, okay. All right, and then our team, Lori Young and Jim Walker and Katie Brank. So we're very glad to have all of you here. Okay, for those, we had, okay. For those of you joining us today, we had a comprehensive presentation from Admiral Walsh last night at our keynote dinner, and today we'll begin the important discussion that he laid out. How can we meet the needs for our national security, utilizing our previous and current investments and technology to maximum advantage, and keep our focus and our procurements, keep facing the post-9/11 world of counterinsurgencies, nation-state threats, and fiscal constraints with a wide range of challenges and the need to keep technological advantage. He mentioned two scenarios that we need to consider. One is the Middle East, focused on Islamists and the threats they pose to our global well-being. The second being the threat of a potential rising power in East and Southeast Asia, China. Each of these, which requires different strategies, different types of forces, and different challenges for our technology. Today we have a terrific lineup of speakers to address these challenges. And we began this morning with General James Husch Cartwright, who will give our welcoming remarks. And you have his bio in your booklet, your bio booklet that was available on the tail. But I want to just say a couple of things. One, he is the last general to have been drafted from the farm, from the farm in Illinois to the combat zone in Vietnam. So he has a different perspective on the military than any other military leader in recent years. And a brilliant strategist, he also has a keen knowledge of the new technologies being developed, including cyber technology. And I found out this morning that he was also at the center of our successful effort to shoot down the satellite that was threatening to wobble into our world very quickly a few years back. So I'm not going to take any longer. I'd like to hear from General Cartwright. Thank you very much.
I was here, I guess, with the Council on Foreign Affairs and Ben's about, 3 or 4 weeks ago. I flunked. I'm back. And my task, as I understand it this morning, is to kind of set the stage, maybe be a little provocative, and certainly maybe over-exaggerate for effect. We'll skip over the pieces. And Professor, we never had a professor of budgets. We had David. But, so most of this work was done absent any academic expertise, quite frankly. And we usually, probably the biggest mistake we've always made is we always get this out of sequence. I mean, that's just the reality of the world. Either somebody comes in and says you're out of money and then you develop a strategy, or you develop a strategy completely ignorant of what's going on in the world around you, and then you try to make it fit. We've taken old strategies and tried to make them new again. All of those things have been the reality of the world. It's never quite the way you want it to be, and you try to do the best you can to adapt. You look for time horizons. One of the biggest challenges that we've had over the last probably 10 years is that most of our strategies up to that point were developed on horizons of what could you do to develop a capability for what you think is going to happen in 20 years. Okay? Because that's how long it takes to develop the next airplane, ship, you name it. Okay? And so we guess. We're perfect. We've always guessed wrong. And that's just the reality of the world. But over the last 10 years, we've moved out of what is the industrial age, and probably the greatest baseline for that is patent law, which is about a 20-year horizon. Okay? And we're into Moore's law, which is more like an 18-month horizon. And we're keeping the PPB, and we always change the last acronym, SE, whatever it is this week, system of 5-year budgeting, living in a world of Moore's law, where the enemy decides how quickly you need to advance and come up with new capability, not budgeteers, strategists, et cetera. And so it's a very difficult environment that we live in, trying to reconcile the disconnects of a country in the United States who has and came up as an agrarian society, made a transition in the Civil War to an industrial society, now has all of its incentive structure, all of its laws, based in that 20-year construct of property, et cetera. And yet we live in an IT world and trying to match that. The battlefield, the IED fight, improvised explosive device fight, is about a 30-day fight. You invent a fuse, I invent a counter, you invent a new fuse. Okay? Doesn't wait for 5 years to get rebudgeted. And the results of not keeping up with it are catastrophic for many. Okay? And the cyber fight that we have out there today is running on about a 9 to 14 day. You come up with a virus, I come up with a counter, you come up with a virus. That's the reality of competition in the world that we live in. The other realities that we have to deal with here are on a more global 10, 50, 100-year cycle, are the realities of demographics and how this world is being shaped, and climate and all of those things, all of which play into these challenges, all of which must be considered when you're thinking about strategy, all of which must be considered about force constructs and also about budgets. And so today, in a general trend, you look from the equator, 20 north, 20 south, you see an explosion in the population of males 17 to 35. no matter the fact that we've had pretty much constant war for the last 20 years, that population has grown in the face of conflict. That's not known in precedent in the world as we know it today, but that's the reality of warfare today. You know, in this country, 1% of the population is involved in these conflicts. Less than 4% of your budget, GNP, is involved in these conflicts. Okay? I mean, we're not swinging big numbers. They're getting a lot of attention. They have a lot of strategic implication. But when you take them down to these issues, they're relatively stable, quite frankly. The changes are not significant. As you look around, though, and you look at the demographics, in wars in the past, think about casualty rates in the range of somewhere between 60 and 70%. You get shot, you die 60%, 70% of the time. Okay? In this conflict, 99% of the time you get shot, you come home and you're fine. Okay? You may, in fact, have a long-term disability, but you live. That's a fundamental shift in warfare. It's a fundamental shift in demographics. It's a fundamental shift in strategy. Okay? And it will continue to shift, okay? Because we're developing more and more precision, more and more capability to influence the will or impose the will on the adversary, which is what we're trying to do. That's the essence of warfare. That's the essence of diplomacy. That's the essence of statesmanship, okay? Imposing will upon someone else. Get them to do what you want them to do somehow. Okay? As we look at the demographics, if you shift in north of 20 north and 20 south, you get into an aging population, an aging infrastructure. Okay? But it is also the belt where most of the resources are. So we have, and we are working through in this country and all across the globe, the realities of aging populations, changes in their risk calculus. The older you get, the less risk you're willing to take. Okay? Aging infrastructure, the older you get, the more money you want to put into when you can't make money and when you are sick. Okay? I mean, it's just the reality of the world. You go south of that, and it is, what do I need to do what I do? Where's my house? How am I going to raise a family? I mean, it's just a fundamental shift. And you can look at that globally, and it's true. It has different variances, but it's true. And you can also see a migration of the have-nots in the challenged areas where there is less resource, less opportunity, migrating north. That's going on. It's very large in Europe. It's very large in the United States. You look at that, you're now seeing it actually start to get up into Scandinavia, Canada, etc. That's just the reality. And it's going with global warming, so there's more opportunity and more resources. So it's continuing at a pace that's significant. Those crossing of boundaries, those banding of resource are also bands of conflict, where you start to match or mix and match different criteria for success, so to speak. How do we value our lives? And so as you look at that central band, there's a huge lack of resource. What resource is there is mal-distributed. In other words, it's not put out across the population. The population does not feel empowered. They do not believe that their governments are accountable for the way that their lives are going. They can't build the house, buy the car, whatever it is. And so they're going to have a different risk calculus about fighting about that than somebody who has those assets. You go north, Russia will never again see a million-man army. I mean, it's just demographically not possible. Okay? You just follow that all the way across the earth. If you go to the Pacific, you have rising economies, you have competition for resources, but it's fragile. The solution for North Korea is a 50 to 100-year solution, not a war. It's just not. Neither one of the countries, none of the countries, three major ones, Russia to the north, China to the west, South Korea to the south, can afford to have that population dumped on their country. They do not have the capacity in their budgetary capability and their resources to absorb that in a year or 10 years. They need 50 to 100. China and South Korea have built rail and highways and bridges right up to the border. Okay? They could not afford to have those things open and flood. They can afford to have an integration and a slow movement towards the assimilation of the population and bringing it in and making it productive and making the resources available to allow them to find a way of life, okay, that them being North Korea. Any catastrophic disruption of that is really unbearable by any of those countries out there. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Move yourself to the Middle East, and you're pretty much in the same. You have several countries, nations in that region who live on one commodity. That is the source of wealth. That commodity goes away, they really don't have a sufficient base to do much more and feed and house and all of those things. If you throw a disruption into that activity, it's going to get worse, not better. War in those areas will not make it better. You just can't. There's not enough resource to make it better. So the strategies have to understand that. They have to understand that even though that's a reality, it's not likely to be what's going to happen. Conflict is likely to be the alternative here. What kind of conflict? How it manifests itself? We just have been through 10 years of conflict in that area. As we walk away, that's not a statement of strategy. As we walk away, it's kind of like the election we went through. There's not going to be much different when we leave. Okay? I mean, it's just a reality. We will pour our nation's treasure into that area. It will not be enough to make a difference. Okay? I mean, at the macro level. And so we just have to understand that. But as we move towards the future, things like nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, these migratory activities, these have and have not activities in the world are going to be the centers of conflict and disruption. And so the military that we build and the strategies that this country puts forward have to be able to adapt and adjust to most likely and most dangerous. You have to cover both. You can't afford not to. Okay? The price that we pay for that, again, right now, less than 1% of our population and less than 4% of our budget. So as we look to take potentially that 4% and pay off debts so that we can make sure that we live in gated communities and play golf, you know, and hand over the debt to our kids, we have to think about what is it we want to spend our resources on. Okay? Number one. Number two, we're also an aging population. In fact, we're about the oldest. We're up in the 40s. Somewhere in mid-30s is kind of the crossover point. Okay? The reason that we are not yet feeling as much pain as others, quite frankly, is our immigration policy. All right? That's a broad swipe. But immigrants, think about what it would take for you to give up everything, family, location, knowledge, all the anchor points that you have, and go someplace else. Think of what the risk calculus is to do that. And think of the risk calculus then that you bring to wherever you end up. Immigrants are really at the essence of things like small business, things like innovation, because their risk calculus is fundamentally different. Okay? You have to manage that in an immigration policy, but if we lose that, we do so at our peril. So that's the context I give you for the discussion that we're going to have. Remember to keep strategy first, and remember that we break all the rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Husch. I'm the guy leading this panel today. It's ostensibly listed as the military panel. It's really not. Essentially what this is best I can tell, is 3 fighter pilots and scales. That's it. That's probably good news, but we'll probably find out. I went home, and you can read the bios of these distinguished gentlemen. I won't go into that because of time. I went home last night after hearing Pat's talk, and I tore up my talk and started over again. And I'm going to just walk down through my points. Remember now, I'm not a fighter pilot. I'm a historian. Couldn't ask for two different Myers-Briggs scores than me and these other three gentlemen to my left. So here goes. But we're not going to fight China. Come on. This pivot to Asia is really a pre-election head fake to change the subject away from the administration's failures in Afghanistan. I think Husch is exactly right. We walk away and it's sort of like pulling your hand out of a bucket of water. Afghanistan will come back to haunt us, but in the Pacific, please, great nuclear powers don't fight great nuclear powers. And the idea that we're going to go to nuclear war over rocks and shoals and fishing rights is the ultimate asymmetry between ends and means. And the idea of somehow poking 1.3 billion people in the chest in order to invade them or mess around with them reminds me of that great quote by Bismarck. You may remember it in the 1890s. One of the general staff officers came in and told Bismarck that the British were developing a capability to do amphibious landings on the coast of Prussia. And Bismarck replied, well, if they do, we shall have them arrested. And I think we see a similar set of circumstances here. The Chinese National Police will take care of us quite well, thank you. And a little history here, just so you know, I've been at this China business for about 40 years, 30 years. I remember in 1981 as a lieutenant colonel staff officer, I ran into the famous two Andys. That's Andy Marshall and Andy Krepinevich, and we're just getting ready to spin up to, in the Reagan era, to beat the Russians, and Andy's talking about fighting China. I said, holy crap. And I go back in Army After Next in 1993-94, where we're dealing with a strategic pause and getting ready to go to Bosnia, and Andy Krepinevich and Andy Marshall are talking about fighting China. I go to the War College, and both of them come and talk to the class fighting China. I was a member of the QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, in 2008. And we were briefed by John Landry from the CIA, Andy Krepinevich, and Andy Marshall, and all they could talk about was fighting China. So it just seems like they want to fight China, but every time it gets to the point where their dreams will be fulfilled, we keep running into the realities of real war. And I think that's probably going to be my point to you today. I agree with Husch completely. That means I'm done and I'll get off the stage. No, wait a minute. I'm a historian, as I said, and I tend to take the longer view.
You're done.
No, you know me better than that. We're engaged in what some historians call the American era of war in the American era, which is our dominance on the strategic security environment since the end of World War II. And we have consistently followed at the end of uncomfortable, accidental and major wars precisely the same pattern of behavior. Nothing's different now. We turn away from the ugliness of a long war that we backed into, and we go back to a technological, techno solution. Doesn't change. Some of these may sound familiar to you, to your undergraduates, maybe not. Eisenhower's new look, deep strike, net-centric warfare, effects-based operations, and the famous Rebecca Grant's thesis in the late 90s about the gift of time, and lately, air-sea battle. Air-sea battle is not air-sea battle, it's air-air battle. But nonetheless, it's an operational concept trying to masquerade as a strategy, which just goes to show you what 10 years of lack of PME has done to the professional officer corps. It's also interesting that this comes from a civilian, not anyone in uniform. But the excuses are always the same, you know. You need a high-tech military to fight a high-tech military, so you scour the world trying to find somebody who's a high-tech military. You got to take the Russians off because they're not high-tech anymore. That leaves the Chinese. Another one that came up last night, which just always tickles me to death, is, oh, well, we're going to use SOF and drones. Yeah, right. I mean, you know, this would be so great if we only had, if war was a one-sided affair. But the enemy has a vote. And the enemy is very good in getting better at accommodating softened drones, just as he's accommodated other styles of warfare that we've tried, from the march to Baghdad to stability operations in 2004. And that's not working. Here's the other one. We're going to fight our way in. Anti-access strategy, strategic speed, all the other stuff you've been reading about. No, we're not. We haven't had an amphibious operation since Incheon, and that was an option. We're going to do what we've always done in the American-era war. We're going to walk ashore and fight a war we probably shouldn't be involved in. Here's the other one. Well, we can take risk in land power because armies can always be raised quicker than the technical services. Absolutely wrong. Now, I will admit to you that bad armies can be raised quicker than the technical services. But war on land is essentially a human endeavor, and you develop it much like you develop a good wine. It takes time. It can't be rushed. So, and it's so curious in a culture like ours, where our vulnerable center of gravity is dead Americans. So you would think, as a part of our national strategy, we would build up our land forces sufficient to where those who are most likely to die would be those who are best protected. Isn't it interesting? And the enemy certainly knows that. He knows what our vulnerability is. It's not defeating Americans on the battlefield. It's just killing us as a strategic end. A couple of points. Remember, the only thing we've run out of in 70 years of the American era that seriously affected our national military strategy and our operational employment of military forces, it comes down to 4% of the population, and that's infantrymen. We always run out of infantry. We certainly